Well, good afternoon again, and a really warm welcome to our bite-sized corrosion this afternoon. It's so fabulous that you have been able to join us today as we kick off our 2022 winter series with a 6-session discussion on pipeline integrity management. Now, before we get started, just to introduce myself, my name is Vanessa Sealy-Fisher, and today I'm joined by Neil Webb, and we'll be introducing the concept of pipeline integrity management and the ECDA principles. Now let's have a look at our topic of discussion today, which is pipeline integrity management. And this is really becoming such a critical consideration. We all know that our resources are increasingly constrained, our infrastructure is generally aging, and it's hard to know where we should be spending our money and how to target our approach. Neil, what are your thoughts?
Well, there is, of course, one way of finding out where you need to spend your money, and that's to see where the water is going. But of course, this is somewhat rather drastic. And whereas water provides free irrigation, although sometimes it does cause a lot of damage, if you had similar leaks on gas or petroleum products or other hazardous pipelines, the consequences could be disastrous. So really what we want to discuss in these few weeks is how do we go about assessing the condition of our pipelines so that we don't land up in this somewhat extreme situation?
Sure, I think it's important that we look at the questions of things like, has our pipeline corroded, or how long will it last, or what must I do? Are there other ways that we can possibly look at our pipeline?
Well, certainly we don't want to wait for it to leak to find where it's about to corrode. And in the oil and gas industry and hazardous pipelines, they use a technique known as pigging. A pig is a pipeline inspection gauge. That's where the name comes from. Typically, it is something that you can push through a pipeline, and it's fitted with sensors, as you can see in this photograph over here. And these can tell what the residual wall thickness is, and it can tell you whether you've got internal corrosion or external corrosion, how much, where, how bad it is, and so on. And that's a picture taken down a pipe of a pig on its way.
Obviously, your pipe has to be able to carry this.
Yeah, for sure. So here you can see that this particular pipeline has what is called a full bore inline valve, which when it's open will allow the pig or the inspection vehicle, whatever you want to call it, to pass through. We also have a requirement that bends in the pipeline are long radius bends. Normally these are forged, or not as in counterfeit banknotes, but hot formed to form a smooth curve so that those inspection tools can actually pass through the pipeline.
That's not always possible. What if you have a right-angled bend? Could it be modified in any way?
These are the typical bends that we see on water pipelines. And in fact, you also see these on some of the older hazardous pipelines. And these can present a challenge for pigs. And in many cases, you actually can't get a pig to go through the pipe. And not only do we have this issue of mitered bends, but frequently the inline valves are not the same diameter as the pipeline itself. So the pig comes along merrily and gets to this point and it gets stuck and then it squeals, quite literally. And of course, in water pipelines, we primarily have butterfly valves or gate valves. And you can imagine what is going to happen to a pig if it goes hurtling down a pipe and encounters a butterfly valve, even if it's open.
Oh dear, cut in half.
Yeah. Anyway, we're going to be concentrating on the outside of the pipeline as opposed to the inside. And as I said, these pigs will tell you whether you've got corrosion either internally or externally. But the critical thing is that it has become apparent there are a number of pipelines, both hazardous pipelines and water pipelines, where it is not possible to pig. And the question then comes in, how do we find out what the condition of the pipeline is and where we need to then apply our resources in order to undertake maintenance and or interventions. And you'll recall that last year we presented a series of discussions on the various survey techniques that are available for evaluating coatings and cathodic protection. And we're going to see in this series now how we can use these survey techniques in trying to predict what the situation is with an existing pipeline without having to dig it up across the entire length of the line.
Well, just if I can interject there, just a quick punt. If you missed that series or you want a refresher, you're welcome to pop along to our Teachable platform and you'll be able to access all of those discussions that we did have on these survey techniques. Now, Neil, if we are looking at the external of a pipe, I feel like we've just got a whole jigsaw of information that we need to consider. We've got our soils and our water, and in fact, they're all on this slide. What about the aeration of our soil, the condition of our coating and wrapping? All of those surely must play a role.
Well, yes, absolutely. And we evaluate these situations in order to predict where one would expect to get external corrosion, for example. So in the case of soils, this is just an example of a situation where there was retained water, a wetland, as you can see up there in the right-hand corner, some chemical contamination of the ground, runoff from a slimes dam or a chemical process or something like that. Not a very acceptable situation, but unfortunately these occur. And of course, there are lots of naturally occurring features like salt pans and so on, which are extremely corrosive. And these form one of the primary causes of external corrosion. But we also need to remember that because we have limited resources, we need to do a full-on risk analysis of the situation. And this particular one, it's actually one that was written for health and safety, but it doesn't matter. On the left-hand side, you have the likelihood or the probability, and across the top, you have the consequence or the effects of something going wrong. Whilst the likelihood is based on primarily soil conditions and other external influences, we also need to consider that the consequence of a leak or a burst will have different effects depending on where the pipeline is, what kind of operating conditions it is. Is it a low pressure line or a high pressure line? Is it water? Is it sewage? Is it slurry? We had a situation many, many years ago where a slurry pipeline burst and flooded a village with slimes from a mining operation.
Yeah, and that's your consequence effect that really highlights the importance of considering that.
Yes, for sure. And so the consequence of something leaking in a desert environment, for example, if this was a water pipeline in the desert, which this one actually is, the consequences of a leak there would be some soil erosion. Whereas the consequence of a leak on a pipeline that's traversing under a harbor entrance, for example, would be quite dire.
So essentially what we need is something to help us take that risk matrix and put all our puzzle pieces all together into a single sensible fashion.
And that's right. And if effectively that is what this series is going to be about. And the full name is External Corrosion Direct Assessment. That's what this acronym of ECDA stands for. And it is a process for establishing both the risk and the consequence and enabling you to prioritize your resources in order to come up with an acceptable integrity management plan.
It's interesting how cathodic protection seems to have cornered the acronym market. So this adds another little acronym to our suite, ECDA, and it rolls off the tongue. Now, ECDA is well documented. It's a NACE standard, as we've got up on that slide there, SPO 502, currently the 2010 version. Neil, this is divided into some stages. Can we just have a quick look at what they are?
Yes, so the ECDA process then is a documented and structured analysis of the pipeline and the probability of external corrosion, which is why it is called ECDA, External Corrosion Direct Assessment. There are others. There's an ICDA process as well for internal corrosion, for example. So the process is divided into 4 stages. Pre-assessment is an exercise, primarily then a desktop exercise, where you look at the route of the pipeline and look at the identifiable soil conditions, for example, but not only soil conditions, but also what is called zoning, which is dividing the pipeline according to demographics. So a pipeline through a desert section, or a pipeline that goes from outlying areas into a built-up area. Even within a built-up area, a pipeline under a major highway is a higher risk than a pipeline along a quiet back road. A pipeline next to a school is a much higher risk than a pipeline running through the open countryside, and so on. And also then the conditions of the pipeline are taken into account. What is it constructed from? What was the material of construction? Is it an old pipeline where perhaps the steel doesn't have the impact properties that modern steels have? And so on. So there's a huge data gathering exercise associated with the pipeline as built and as operated. And then once you have completed that cycle, the second cycle is what is called indirect assessment, and that is typically survey techniques that we spoke about in terms of pipeline surveying, but not only those which are the pipeline itself, but also evaluating the ground conditions, like doing soil resistivity surveying, perhaps using ground penetrating radar, and things like that. Those are all survey conditions that do not require excavation. Based then on the first 2 phases, you then identify areas that are typical of those both zones and call it corrosion risk. And you then carry out this section called direct assessment. And as the name suggests, that's where you physically go and excavate the pipe, open it up, evaluate the ground conditions, the coating conditions, the steel of the pipeline, has it corroded or not, measure the wall thickness. Is it actually the same wall thickness as was designed? And that data is then also documented. And then finally, you take all of that data, put it together, and come up with a validation of the model. So the indirect assessment sets up a model. The direct assessment validates the model, and then you check that validation to see whether or not your model is correct. And based on that, you then come back with a residual safe operating life. And then, so perhaps you come up with a predicted useful remaining life of 10 years. The assessment then says, well, if you're predicting 10 years, you go back in 5 years and check to make sure that the conditions are still the same. And so the whole thing then is a very rigorous, structured process, and it really only works if you in fact follow it through and do it to the letter. If you do a half-hearted approach and don't finish it off and close the loop, you might as well not even have bothered.
It's like starting a puzzle with missing pieces. I do think that the risk assessment sort of layout is quite a good picture to keep in one's mind for the duration of the ECDA study. And I know that we're going to be spending the next 4 sessions looking at each of these 4 stages or assessments in some detail and try and get really practical with them. But keeping that risk assessment framework in mind, with which we're all very familiar with because of our health and safety requirements, I think that's quite helpful, because then when you come up with a green or a yellow or a red in terms of your assessment, we're already familiar with the concept that red is deal with it right now, and green is pretty much you're good to go.
We've actually been applying this same philosophy now for many, many years. And in fact, one of the very early projects that I was involved in the early 1980s, looking back on it now, we actually undertook ECDA, even though we didn't call it that at the time, because this process was really only documented in the early 2000s. And the pipeline, I remember we had something like a 300 kilometer pipeline, and it was divided into, at that stage, something like 4 or 5 zones, where the pipeline was replaced for the first 10 kilometers, and then there was 20 kilometers of it that was rewrapped, and there was another section of it where they went in and undertook spot repairs to the wrapping systems, and it worked pretty well. And at the end of the day, there was actually only one section that surprised us, where a leak occurred during the final pressure testing of the line. And it was something where we had a suspicion that things were not completely kosher, but it had not been conclusively proven. And it was a fast-track project, so it got commissioned before the process was completely formalized. Anyway, at the end of the day, it proved a point, and that particular area was then also repaired, and then the pipeline operated. And the operator then continued to apply that same technique for many, many years, and had a progressive pipeline upgrading and replacement philosophy over the next 18 years, I suppose, during which they actually had no further leaks, and they were able to upgrade and maintain the pipeline.
I think the asset owner is committed to the longevity of the asset. This is a fantastic technique to highlight where you start and not get bogged down by the feeling that you have to repeat the same thing endlessly because that's what the rules say, but rather looking at it strategically, saying we've got this much budget, we know we've got a pipeline that is at risk or could be at risk. Let's identify where those risk areas are and then manage the risks in that area. And I think we're seeing this risk-based approach actually featuring in so many facets of our lives. And it's really useful that we've got a tool like ECDA, which formalizes it really quite clearly and gives us some good guidance on what to think about, probably ask some questions that we may have missed, and helps us to draw meaningful conclusions. I think it's a specification or a standard practice that NACE have developed that's actually very practical and really useful. And I'm looking forward to expanding it.
Well, the interesting thing about this is that not only is the standard practice very detailed, but it has in fact been approved by the authorities as an acceptable risk mitigation tool, so that if you as a pipeline owner undertake the analysis in accordance with that standard and you follow it through, that is definitely the bottom line. You have to follow it through and go through all the stages, you then are deemed to have acted as a responsible asset owner. It has been accepted as a condition for an ongoing operating license for a hazardous pipeline, if you have undertaken this sort of risk analysis.
I think many of us forget to complete the job. So this is one where we really do need to look at working through the whole process. And so we will work through that, as I said, over the next 4 sessions. I'm really excited that Francis Bradfield is going to be joining us tomorrow and discussing with us the pre-assessment stage. So I think that's going to be an interesting discussion.
Well, Francis is well versed in this, having actually undertaken these studies herself on some hazardous pipelines and pushed it right through from the setting up of the pre-assessment right through to the final post-assessment stage. So I think that she's going to be giving us a well-rounded review of the entire process.
I'm certainly looking forward to it. Well, I think that just about wraps up this little introductory discussion on what is pipeline integrity management using the ECDA process.